The sequence of horrific crimes by children against other children and their teachers has rekindled a debate on artistic freedom and freedom of expression. There have been links made between very violent, antisocial behavior and some forms of entertainment, music, and television. Others have ridiculed this and says that there's no connection whatsoever, there is no influence, or if it is, it's only marginal. But then again, we have the divine injunction in the Gospels where we are told that rather than to scandalize a young one, it is better than such a person have a millstone hung about his neck and cast into the sea. I'm Julius Smetona. This is What Catholics Believe. With me to discuss influence and the media is Father William Jenkins. Father Jenkins is a priest who celebrates the traditional Latin Mass exclusively and is determined to hold fast to the traditions. Father Jenkins, there was an article which I think was a combination of common sense and also a shocking lack of responsibility and abdication from authority. The U.S. bishops recently urged Americans to tune in to families, and what they said is they were concerned about the culture of violence, the internet explosion, hate radio, the movies, television, impure telephone services and such, and their advice to the average American was to shut down the tube, quote, video games and talk radio for one day each week and take time as a family to pray and talk about how people's understanding, quote, of sex and violence is shaped by media images. That's kind of like maybe saying to a murderer, instead of killing 7 days a week, and you kill 6 days a week, and the seventh day, why don't you discuss and pray about the consequences of some of your actions? And what was even, to me, more striking was they said the following: the test for our church is not simply have we kept the faith, but have we shared the faith? And they asked, not told, they asked Catholic schools, seminaries, and catechetical programs to make church social teaching part of their curriculum. What's your reaction to this statement, and can entertainment influence behavior?
Well, of course, entertainment does influence behavior, and those who are working in the media need to have an appreciation of the tremendous power they have in their hands, because when they do entertain, they are asking people to surrender their minds and their imaginations to what they're putting before them. What entertains us is has a very powerful effect on us, because all too often we drop any critical faculties, and we just watch and take it in. And it's a time like that that we're most susceptible to being influenced.
Our guard is down, so to speak.
Our guard is down. We find it attractive. In other words, if I were, let's say, producing a film in which there was a lot of vicious violence, I would be concerned of what the ultimate impact that would be on impressionable people, especially young people, who would come and watch that as entertainment. I mean, when our children begin to watch violent things for their entertainment value, how do we expect that is going to affect them as time goes on? In the entertainment industry, a great deal of the money that flows through is from advertising. And the whole idea of advertising is predicated on the fact that
you can manipulate people.
Well, not only it influences people. When you want to influence people, that's being paid millions of dollars to influence people through this medium.
As one of the bishops said, if it sells toothpaste, it's going to influence behavior.
Well, when it comes down to then what actually happens on the streets between one child or another, or one adult and another, then obviously the same holds true. You're going to have some effect. And it's enormous power. It's like the power of fire. It can be used for good, or it can be used for ill.
People seem to deny this, but I remember one statistic that said that the average teenager, by the time he or she reaches 18, will have witnessed 17,000 murders on television. And to me, when you see some of this stuff, it is just unbelievable how graphic, how gory it can be. And it's done in such a routine, cold manner. And yet they will say that, oh, this is just entertainment.
You know, Julius, some time ago we had images of children playing in the streets of Beirut, playing in the streets of various cities now in Albania and Serbia, with corpses lying around. Sometimes we've seen children actually stepping, running, jumping over the bodies as though they were just some sort of any other refuse or obstacle in the street. We ask ourselves, how can children be so insensitive to the fact that this is a human corpse they're playing around? But we see happening in our own country children who are being desensitized to that very type of thing. They witness the violence, if not on the streets outside their homes, they witness it on the big screen over and over again. As you say, 17,000 murders in the course of growing up and reaching maturity. And you know, one has to ask himself, well, what does this do to a child's horror for cruelty, for butchery? Obviously, when one sees this happen over and over again, it does lessen the horror of it all. And when the horror of it all disappears, then what is that child thinking? What happens in the mind and the morality of that child? Let alone when the child then begins to consider it to be entertaining to watch such things happen.
We've had just you know, the sequence of just unimaginable crimes by children against children. The last one I heard was where a 5-year-old went after his kindergarten teacher with a gun because she made him have a timeout. There's also these absolutely vicious, senseless crimes which apparently had no motivation whatsoever. Would you establish a link between popular entertainment, the movies, the entertainment industry, and these crimes? To what extent are these movies which glorify violence and those who are inflicting it, to what extent do they bear a responsibility in motivating this type of behavior?
I think there's a great responsibility, and yes, there is a close tie. It was always the purpose of the church to function as the conscience of the country, the conscience of the world. I mean, this is what our Lord Jesus Christ established the church to do, to speak for him in the world and to speak his words, and that meant to condemn what is damnable and to approve what is commendable. And so in the past, the church always was responsible for speaking boldly and clearly about what was right and what was wrong. And sometimes people didn't like it, but then often people didn't like what our Lord had to say either. So, and they wound up crucifying him for it. And our Lord said, if they hate me, they will hate you also. So the church was never surprised about that. That's why this statement by the modern bishops is so weak. There is a very severe and immediate consequence to turning viciousness and impurity into a form of entertainment. You're referring to some crimes recently committed at large in society. Of course, you're familiar with the shootings in the schools. Now, notice, there are millions of school children in thousands of schools, public schools in this country. And so we're not saying that you know, every child who goes to these schools is carrying a weapon with him. But actually a large percentage of them are. 10% of the schools in this country reported children bringing weapons to school. I forget whether it was 94 or 95. But so there is, it's a significant problem. But the thing is too that when a child does bring a weapon to school and does kill 2 or 3 children, fellow students, it is so shocking to us because of all the places we want the children to be safe. After the home, it would be the schools. And although there are thousands of people who are killed every week in automobile crashes, when one airplane goes down and kills 80 people, that is big news. Just because of the idea of all of those people being killed in this way at one time. And so, even though when, let's say, Kip Kinkel went in and shot a number of students in the school, executing one and killing another at some range, this was big news, even though there were only 2 deaths, just because it's our schools, it's our children killing each other. But the entertainment industry does have something to say in this. It can either edify and even sanctify as a medium, or it can degrade and turn children as one influence into thinking like monsters almost. There was an article in the June 27th edition, the June 27th, 1998 edition of the Washington Times, actually a column by Robert Holland, in which he comments on what was happening in the lives of the children who opened fire in Arkansas recently, killing a number of their fellow students down there. Now these were 11 and 13-year-old boys. And the media painted them as being actually fairly normal children, kind of happy-go-lucky, and their home lives were not totally messed up and so on. But their teachers discovered by talking with other students that during the weeks preceding these murders, when they perched themselves on that grassy knoll and began to pick off their fellow students who were streaming out of the school after one of the boys had set off a false fire alarm, is that they had been getting into satanic music during the time before the killings. And I'm going to read from this article, if I may, for a few moments. This is what Robert Holland says. In the days following the tragedy, this teacher of one of the children, Miss Pelly was her name, who had 13-year-old Mitchell Johnson in class, talked at length to 7th graders and learned that Mitchell had become immersed in gangsta rap during the few months before the shootings. The boys' favorites were Tupac Shakur and Bone Thugs and Harmony. His classmates said he brought their music to school with him, sang the lyrics over and over, and played a cassette in the restroom, quote, about coming to school and killing all the kids, unquote. He goes on to talk about some of the recordings made by these what they're popularly called artists, and all of the gruesome and cruel things that they sing about. And he goes on to say, in varying degrees, the violent pop culture seemed to obsess every one of this spring's juvenile schoolhouse killers, the New York Times reported last Sunday. The Pearl, Mississippi, and the Springfield, Oregon boys turned fiends, for example, were both into the nihilistic rock of Marilyn Manson, as well as violent fantasy video games. Now, is this merely coincidental? I don't believe it is, no. This Marilyn Manson, who is a Satanist, actually he's an Ohioan, grew up with the name of Brian Warner. And he fell into this. Evidently, he thought he'd make a name for himself by being weirder than most other people. And I guess that sells today, because there's an army of 12 and 13-year-old boys and girls who follow him everywhere he goes, it seems. And he is a member, or was a member, of the Satanic Church, led by Anton LaVey, who just died. This Anton LaVey is quoted in some notes about Marilyn Manson. Anton LaVey is quoted as having said, "An emotionally charged rock concert performed by dedicated Satanists is today's rally, ritual, and call to arms." When he says call to arms, he gives you kind of a vision of an army.
He's not kidding.
And you know, it makes you wonder. When you see what goes on, and the media does report, you know, something about Marilyn, what was his name?
Marilyn
Manson's performances, which consist of lacerating himself and vomiting and all kinds of disgusting things. You wonder if this Marilyn Manson were to get up and talk to, you know, 5,000 of these children and say, look, I target this person as an enemy and I want you to kill him. I wonder how they would react. Actually, I don't wonder how they would react. I'm afraid I know how they would react. Like, these children are so mesmerized by this, by this idea of killing and destruction, that I'm afraid that he would unleash thousands of people on the streets looking.
He'd be a Pied Piper.
No,
right.
I'm afraid you're right.
You're watching What Catholics Believe. We're discussing influence. I'd like to 163. Father, maybe you can turn to this point. The thing that was striking, again, about the bishops dealing with the problem of violence and impurity was really not very consequential, said maybe you could one day a week cut down on it. They asked that the seminaries and Catholic schools teach about Catholic social principles. They did not get into the question of censorship. They thought it was undesirable. They did say that reviewing licenses of radio and television stations should be a little more rigorous and meaningful. And they admitted that it's not going to have any serious impact, their statement. And one then said, this is a step that will put us on the record that we are serious about this. So apparently up until this time, no one thought they were serious about this. But could you please contrast this position and what's happening now to what was set forth by Pope Pius XI, Pope Pius XII, the Legion of Decency, the prescription against attending bad movies or reading bad books that are harmful to faith and morals?
Well, Pope Pius XI, back in the 1930s, issued an entire encyclical, worldwide letter to all the bishops throughout the world, addressing this matter of the responsibility of the media to see to it that they edify and try to bring the best out of the people and not the worst. And it stressed the power of the media in influencing the general population, those they're entertaining and informing. And of course, there was, as you say, the Legion of Decency, which basically found its way into every Catholic parish just a generation or a generation and a half ago.
Early 60s, it was still there.
Which the people who were there in the church, Mass after Mass, would actually stand up there before the Blessed Sacrament and read aloud a pledge that they would not only limit themselves to only decent entertainment, but that they would not allow any soul for whom they were responsible, such as their children or their students, to indulge in immoral and evil entertainment. Now, some would say, well, this is censorship, this is censorship. Well, I mean, censorship goes on all the time. It goes on by people in the media. There are always decisions made about, well, what are we going to put on the air? What are we not going to put on the air? Some things are simply ruled unfit, or perhaps they just don't have time for them, whatever. They have all kinds of reasons for leaving something out. And somebody somewhere is deciding what people need to know and what they don't need to know. So, you know, looking at censorship as some kind of shibboleth is, you know, as though it were some kind of golden calf, is not right. You know, but in any case, we have to try to restore that sense of responsibility in the individual person for what he allows himself to see and what he allows his children to see, because what goes in the imagination doesn't just pass through as it does physically.
Especially when it's a visual image that might be there for years and years.
It'll be there until the day they die.
You know, this is interesting that I believe Gone with the Wind, which is, you know, a great classic and whatever, that was actually condemned by the bishops because of its treatment of marriage. Now, my question is, Gone with the Wind today is rated G. It would be considered pristine in its purity compared to what's on today. If the bishops condemned that and said that if you are violating divine law, if you just watch that for entertainment, what would be said about today's movies? And I'm even wondering if even 1%...
Take Titanic, for example. I mean, in the movie Titanic, virtually every commandment was broken. I mean, there was a scene of partial nudity, right? And we're talking about fornication, adultery, blasphemy, right on down the line. And yet this is considered to be PG-13. And we wonder why our 13 and 14-year-olds talk the way they do, think the way they do. Well, we're filling their minds with these things, you know. By the way, the movie was, you talk about censorship, the movie was a departure from reality. I mean, sure, they showed the ship, they showed the lights, they even had the table service, the whole thing. But it was contrary to truth. I didn't see the movie myself, but I read numerous reviews about it. And that's what the reviews are for. So you're supposed to trust these people, right, to give you an idea what the movie's about. And they talked about how when the scene of panic came for the people scrambling for the lifeboats, they showed that the men were trying to struggle their way into the lifeboats and leave the women and children behind. In fact, the truth is that the vast majority of men on the boats died, and the vast majority of women and children survived because the men in that day and age
Chivalry.
stepped back.
Right.
One noted millionaire carried his wife to the boat, put her in, and then bade her farewell. He would not get in the boat next to her. He said, "No one will be ever able to say that I was a coward." And I think it was 70% of the men in first class drowned, 80% in second, and 90% in third. Something like that.
Wow.
But the one review I read, and by the way, that review was written by the editor of the CFR, the Council on Foreign Relations magazine, National or Current Affairs.
Foreign Affairs, yeah. Foreign Affairs.
Foreign Affairs. He said that the reason why this was falsified is because no one would believe today that men just 2 generations ago had been so noble and chivalrous that they would actually observe that principle, women and children first.
There's a couple of things I'd like to run by you, Father, and perhaps you can comment on them. First, about this whole idea of influence that, you know, images and sounds they have, they're just entertainment value, they don't affect behavior. St. Thomas Aquinas taught that all knowledge has origin in sense. Pope Pius XII even went on and talked about the reporting of news. It must be done carefully. Okay? He also said that it can provoke mental judgment and influence the will. So that, again, you're having a tremendous influence by just what you report, how you report it. He said that the communists, and that before the so-called collapse of the Iron Curtain, used the media to root out all religious ideas from the mind. Now, how can you say that, oh, it has no influence when they use this in a deliberate program to eradicate religion? They clearly indicated that you cannot attend shows contrary to right morals. Pope Pius XI ordered the bishops to set up office to encourage decent films and classify others. Theater managers are forbidden in conscience to present film programs which are Catholic contrary to faith and morals. Bad posters were proscribed. Actors could not be involved in pictures contrary to sound morals. And he even said that the film producers, that the bishops had a duty to admonish them and, if necessary, to impose appropriate sanctions. Well, now today, is any of this happening? We're having one program now which is maybe it's accurate in its portrayal of modern religious, but a Jesuit was a consultant, a television program. Where are the bishops? Why? I mean, the most they're saying is, gee, cut down from hate radio and all this stuff from 7 days to 6 days a week. I know I'm kind of lampooning it, but that's really what they're saying, and talk and pray about it, and then the other 6 days go to it. Where are the bishops? Why, I mean, why aren't they doing this?
I think that they feel that they really don't have much influence themselves. They know the media does have a great influence, and I think the bishops understand they don't have much influence, and I think the reason why they don't have much influence is because they have to some extent undermined the authority of bishops by the way they've carried on. The idea of trying to play to the gallery, in a sense, and be popular always undermines authority. And the notion of authority and the notion of responsibility go hand in hand. You can't separate responsibility and authority. And so, insofar as they have somewhat abdicated their responsibility for speaking out with a clear voice of conscience, they have simultaneously abdicated the authority that goes with the responsibility. You can't have one without the other. So really it comes down to parents these days having to exercise the influence that they can, because nobody else even is allowed to, it seems, in public life. Even the parents, to some extent, are not allowed to deny their children certain things that they think are harmful. You know, Hillary Clinton writes a book called It Takes a Village, meaning it takes a village to raise the children. But we have to realize that the problem we meet with today often is that the village is raising the children, that the parents often are not raising them. So the message to the parents would be, it's up to you. You have to raise your children according to the correct moral standards. No one is going to do it for you.
There was a wonderful encyclical written by Pope Pius XII on radio, television, and motion pictures in 1957, and I think we can close with 2 thoughts from that. He said, it is regarding television and radio, he said, number 1, parish priests should warn their faithful that they are forbidden by divine law to listen to radio programs and television programs which are dangerous to faith and morals. And he said, he gave this standard: what you let come into your home or your radio, you should use the same discretion as if you were inviting that person to come into your home. So a television program or a radio program which is offensive or can corrupt or put evil thoughts in your mind, you should treat that just as the same individual. If you don't let that individual into the home, you shouldn't let that television program in the home. This has been What Catholics